Everything you are about to hear is completely real and based on true historical events that unfolded during the Second World War. The images and videos shown throughout this documentary are generated using artificial intelligence only for illustrative purposes, to help visualize these actual events. What follows is the true story of the most brutal urban battle in human history, a confrontation that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives and decided the fate of nations. In the frozen ruins of a city that bore the name of the Soviet dictator, two totalitarian empires collided with such ferocity that the very earth seemed to crack beneath the weight of their fury. Stalingrad, a city that stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, became in the autumn and winter of 1942 the epicenter of human suffering on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. This was not merely a battle for territory or strategic advantage. It became something darker, more primal. It became a fight for survival, a struggle that stripped away every veneer of civilization and reduced warfare to its most savage essence. The men who fought there, German and Soviet alike, entered a hell from which many would never return, and those who did would carry its scars forever. The road to Stalingrad began not in Russia, but in the mind of Adolf Hitler, a man whose strategic vision had become increasingly divorced from military reality. By the summer of 1942, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had failed to achieve its primary objective of destroying the Red Army and toppling Stalin's regime before winter. The Wehrmacht had come terrifyingly close to Moscow in December 1941, only to be driven back by Soviet counterattacks and the brutal Russian winter. But Hitler was not a man who accepted failure or adjusted his expectations to match reality. Instead, he doubled down, planning a massive summer offensive that would target the southern Soviet Union, aiming to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union's economic lifeline. This offensive, designated Case Blue or Fall Blau, was ambitious to the point of recklessness. The plan called for German forces to advance across hundreds of miles of open steppe, split into two diverging army groups, and simultaneously achieve multiple strategic objectives against an enemy that, despite catastrophic losses, still possessed vast reserves of manpower and was learning, adapting, and becoming more tactically sophisticated with each passing month. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, privately expressed deep reservations about the plan's feasibility. He understood that the Wehrmacht was being asked to do too much with insufficient resources across an impossibly vast front. But Hitler was not interested in the cautions of professional soldiers. He had come to believe in his own military genius, and he would tolerate no dissent. The offensive began on June 28, 1942, and initially achieved remarkable success. German forces, spearheaded by the powerful Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, drove deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast numbers of prisoners and pushing the Red Army back toward the Volga. The speed and violence of the advance seemed to vindicate Hitler's strategy. Soviet forces retreated in some disorder, and for a brief moment it appeared that Germany might achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them the previous year. But beneath the surface, fundamental problems were emerging. The German advance was creating an ever longer and more vulnerable supply line stretched across territory that offered few roads and fewer railways. Soviet resistance, though giving ground, was not collapsing. And crucially, Stalin had issued his infamous Order No. 227, better known as Not One Step Back, which forbade unauthorized retreat on pain of execution. The Red Army would stand and fight, no matter the cost. As German forces approached the city of Stalingrad in August 1942, the operation's focus began to shift in ways that would prove catastrophic. Originally, Stalingrad was not the primary objective. It was a secondary target, important primarily as an industrial center and transportation hub on the Volga River. The main thrust was supposed to continue south toward the Caucasus oil fields, but Hitler became increasingly fixated on the city, partly because of its strategic significance, partly because of its symbolic value as the city bearing Stalin's name. Taking Stalingrad would be a propaganda coup of the first order. It would humiliate Stalin personally and demonstrate German invincibility. Military logic began to be subordinated to psychological warfare and personal obsession. General Paulus and his Sixth Army were ordered to take the city. Paulus was an unusual choice for such a critical command. He was a staff officer by training and temperament, a meticulous planner who excelled at organization and logistics, but had limited experience leading troops in combat. He was not a battlefield commander in the mold of Rommel or Guderian, men who led from the front and possessed an intuitive grasp of fluid, mobile warfare. Paulus was cautious, methodical, and deeply loyal to Hitler, which made him compliant but not necessarily effective when faced with the chaos and unpredictability of urban combat. He would need qualities he did not possess to succeed in Stalingrad. The initial German assault on Stalingrad began with a massive aerial bombardment on August 23, 1942. The Luftwaffe, in one of the most concentrated air attacks of the war, subjected the city to wave after wave of bombing. Heinkel and Junkers bombers filled the sky, dropping high explosives and incendiaries that turned Stalingrad into an inferno. Thousands of Soviet civilians were killed in a single day. The city burned with such intensity that the Volga itself seemed to be on fire, petroleum storage tanks ruptured and blazing oil floating on the water's surface. It was a scene of apocalyptic destruction, and it seemed impossible that anyone could survive in such hell. Yet people did survive, and more importantly, the Red Army in Stalingrad did not break. The bombing, while devastating, created a landscape that paradoxically favored the defenders. Stalingrad was transformed into a wasteland of rubble, collapsed buildings, twisted metal, and craters. This terrain was ideal for defensive warfare. Every pile of ruins became a fortification. Every basement became a bunker. Every destroyed factory became a labyrinth of killing zones where attackers could be ambushed from multiple directions. The Germans, who excelled at mobile warfare across open terrain, now found themselves forced to fight building by building, room by room, in conditions that negated their advantages in armor and air power, while playing to Soviet strengths in close-quarters combat and sheer bloody-minded determination. Command of the Soviet defense of Stalingrad fell to General Vasily Chuikov, a tough, ruthless, and tactically brilliant officer who understood instinctively what kind of fight this would be. Chuikov developed a defensive doctrine he called hugging the enemy, which meant keeping Soviet forces in such close proximity to German troops that the Luftwaffe could not provide effective air support without risking hitting their own men. Soviet snipers, assault groups, and machine gun teams operated in the ruins with deadly efficiency, turning every advance into a nightmare of casualties. Chuikov was willing to accept horrific losses if it meant making the Germans pay an even higher price. He told his men that there was no land beyond the Volga, that retreat was not an option, that they would hold or die where they stood. It was not rhetoric. He meant every word. By September, German forces had pushed into the city proper, and the battle entered a new phase of intensity. The fighting in Stalingrad defied every conventional understanding of military operations. This was not warfare as planned in staff colleges. This was industrial-age siege warfare conducted with modern weapons in an urban environment where the rules of engagement dissolved into pure brutality. German soldiers, who had conquered Poland in weeks and France in 40 days, found themselves fighting for days to capture a single apartment building. The Red October factory, the Barricade gun factory, and the tractor factory became legendary killing grounds where men fought hand-to-hand among the machinery, where life expectancy could be measured in hours, where the line between combatant and civilian ceased to have meaning. One location in particular came to symbolize the insanity of the battle. Pavlov's house, an ordinary four-story apartment building in the center of Stalingrad, was fortified and held by a small group of Soviet soldiers under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. From late September to late November 1942, this single building was defended against repeated German assaults. The Soviets turned it into a miniature fortress, digging trenches to connect it to other positions, placing machine guns and anti-tank rifles at strategic points, and fighting with such determination that German commanders claimed they lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they had lost taking Paris. It was probably an exaggeration, but it captured the psychological reality of Stalingrad. Every building was a Pavlov's house. Every street was a death trap. The city consumed men and returned nothing but corpses. The conditions in Stalingrad during autumn and winter of 1942 were beyond anything most soldiers had experienced or imagined. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and both sides fought in cold so severe that weapons froze, frostbite claimed as many casualties as bullets, and wounded men who could not be evacuated simply froze to death in the ruins. Food became scarce. Water became scarce. Sleep became impossible as shelling and fighting continued day and night without pause. German soldiers, accustomed to the relatively humane conditions of the Western Front, found themselves in a meat grinder where daily survival was an achievement. Soviet soldiers, fighting for their homeland, accepted conditions that would have broken most armies and kept fighting. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Men on both sides developed what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress, though no such diagnosis existed then. They simply became what soldiers called shattered. Men who continued to function, but whose eyes held nothing but emptiness. Snipers became particularly feared in Stalingrad's ruins. The most famous Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, became a legend for his skill and the psychological warfare he waged against German troops. Zaitsev was credited with over 200 kills during the battle, though the exact number is disputed. What is not disputed is that Soviet snipers created an atmosphere of terror among German troops, who never knew when a single shot from an invisible enemy would end their lives. The Germans responded by bringing in their own expert marksmen, including Major Erwin Koenig, head of the German sniper school, who was reportedly sent specifically to kill Zaitsev. The duel between Zaitsev and Koenig, popularized in books and films, may have been embellished or even fabricated by Soviet propaganda, but it captured a deeper truth about Stalingrad. This was personal warfare, intimate and murderous, where individual skill and courage mattered as much as strategic planning. While the fighting raged in the ruins, the larger strategic situation was developing in ways that would prove decisive. The German Sixth Army, fixated on capturing Stalingrad, had pushed itself into an increasingly exposed position. The army's flanks were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, allied troops who lacked the equipment, training, and motivation of German forces. These were the weak points in the German line, and Soviet commanders were fully aware of them. General Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most capable military leader, was planning a massive counteroffensive that would exploit these weaknesses and encircle the entire German force at Stalingrad. The operation, codenamed Uranus, was one of the most ambitious Soviet military operations of the war, and it was being prepared with a secrecy and deception effort that kept German intelligence almost completely in the dark. Operation Uranus was launched on November 19, 1942, with devastating effect. Soviet forces attacked north and south of Stalingrad, smashing through the Romanian armies on the flanks and driving deep into the German rear. Within 4 days, the pincers had closed, and the entire German Sixth Army, numbering nearly 300,000 men, was surrounded in a pocket that would become known as the Kessel or Cauldron. Paulus and his staff were shocked by the speed and scale of the Soviet offensive. They had been repeatedly warned by intelligence officers that Soviet forces were massing for an attack, but these warnings had been dismissed by higher command. Now it was too late. The Sixth Army was trapped, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and any hope of easy escape. Hitler's response to the encirclement was characteristic of his leadership style at this stage of the war. He forbade any attempt at breakout, ordering Paulus to hold his position and promising that the Luftwaffe would supply the pocket by air. It was a promise based on fantasy. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the surrounded army. This was logistically impossible given the distances involved, the limited number of transport aircraft available, the terrible weather, and increasingly effective Soviet anti-aircraft defenses. The actual average delivery was less than 100 tons per day, a fraction of what the Sixth Army needed to survive, let alone fight. Men began to starve. Horses were slaughtered for food. The wounded received inadequate medical care. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized they had been abandoned. An attempt was made to relieve the encircled army. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most capable commanders, was given command of a hastily assembled force designated Army Group Don and ordered to break through to Stalingrad. Operation Winter Storm began on December 12th and initially made progress, advancing to within 30 miles of the pocket. Manstein pleaded with Paulus to break out toward the relieving force, but Paulus, bound by Hitler's orders and lacking the fuel and strength to move his shattered divisions, refused. The moment passed. Soviet counterattacks drove Manstein's forces back, and by late December it was clear that no relief was coming. The Sixth Army was doomed. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated into nightmare. Starvation became the primary killer. Men became walking skeletons, too weak to fight or even move. Disease spread unchecked through crowded cellars and bunkers. Dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia claimed thousands. The cold was so severe that wounded men froze solid where they fell. Amputations were performed without anesthesia because medical supplies had run out. Soldiers burned furniture, books, and even their own equipment to stay warm. Some units simply ceased to exist as organized formations, the men too far gone to respond to orders. Yet somehow, under these impossible conditions, most units continued to resist Soviet attacks, fighting not out of belief in victory, but out of pure survival instinct and military discipline. The Soviet forces tightening the noose around Stalingrad were equally exhausted and depleted, but they had the advantage of numbers, supply lines, and momentum. General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Don Front, was ordered to reduce the pocket and destroy the German army. He offered Paulus terms of surrender in early January 1943, promising humane treatment for prisoners under the Geneva Convention. Paulus, still bound by Hitler's orders and perhaps hoping for some miracle, refused. The Soviet response was Operation Ring, a systematic offensive designed to compress and eliminate the pocket section by section. It began on January 10, 1943, with a massive artillery bombardment that could be heard for miles. The remaining German positions were pulverized methodically as Soviet forces advanced through the ruins they had defended months earlier. By late January, the pocket had been split in two, and organized resistance was collapsing. German soldiers surrendered in increasing numbers, stumbling out of their positions with hands raised, many of them too weak to walk without assistance. The Soviets were overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners and struggled to provide even basic care. Thousands died in captivity, not from deliberate cruelty, but from exposure, starvation, and disease that Soviet logistics simply could not address given the scale of the disaster. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a cynical gesture intended to pressure him into committing suicide rather than surrendering, as no German field marshal had ever been captured. Paulus understood the message, but chose life over loyalty. On January 31st, he surrendered to Soviet forces along with his staff. Fighting continued in isolated pockets for another 2 days, but by February 2, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad was over. The remnants of the German 6th Army, along with elements of 4th Panzer Army and Romanian units, had been destroyed. Of the nearly 300,000 German and Axis troops surrounded in the pocket, approximately 91,000 were taken prisoner. Only about 6,000 of these men would survive Soviet captivity and return to Germany in the years following the war. Soviet casualties were equally staggering. Estimates vary, but Soviet military deaths at Stalingrad likely exceeded 400,000, with civilian deaths adding hundreds of thousands more. The city itself had been annihilated, reduced to rubble and ash, uninhabitable and unrecognizable. The strategic and psychological consequences of Stalingrad reverberated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For Germany, it was the first major defeat of an entire army, a catastrophe that could not be hidden or explained away by propaganda. The invincible Wehrmacht had been beaten, not merely in a battle, but in a campaign where Germany had committed its prestige and its best troops. The myth of German military superiority was shattered. Morale at home began to crack. When Joseph Goebbels announced the defeat to the German people, he declared 3 days of national mourning, and for the first time, many Germans began to question whether the war could actually be won. The defeat at Stalingrad marked the psychological turning point of the war in Europe. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was vindication and transformation. Stalin and his generals had proven that the Red Army could not only resist the Wehrmacht, but defeat it decisively. The victory provided an enormous boost to Soviet morale and to Stalin's personal prestige. More importantly, it demonstrated that Soviet commanders had learned from their catastrophic defeats of 1941 and early 1942. They had developed effective operational and tactical methods, learned to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery, and gained confidence in their ability to match German military skill. The road from Stalingrad led westward toward Berlin, and that road would be paved with German defeats. The battle also had profound effects on the individuals who experienced it. The German survivors who returned from Soviet camps brought back stories of suffering that many in Germany found hard to believe or accept. They spoke of a battle where men had eaten their dead to survive, where the wounded had been left to freeze because there was no morphine and no transport, where officers had shot themselves rather than face what was coming. These men were often shunned or avoided, uncomfortable reminders of defeat in a society that increasingly wanted to forget the war altogether. Many never fully readjusted to civilian life, the horrors of Stalingrad having damaged them in ways that could not be repaired. Soviet survivors faced different but equally difficult challenges. They had won, but at such cost that victory itself seemed tainted. Many suffered from what would now be called survivor's guilt, asking themselves why they had lived when so many comrades had died. Soviet authorities were not interested in acknowledging trauma or psychological damage. These men were heroes, and heroes did not complain about nightmares or emotional wounds. They were expected to rebuild the country and move forward. Many did, carrying their pain in silence. The city of Stalingrad itself was rebuilt and renamed Volgograd in 1961 during Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, though many Russians still refer to the battle by its original name, recognizing that some things cannot be renamed or forgotten. The military lessons of Stalingrad were studied intensively by all sides and continue to be analyzed today. For urban warfare, the battle demonstrated that modern technology does not necessarily confer decisive advantage in close-quarters fighting. Tanks and aircraft, the weapons that had revolutionized warfare on open battlefields, became vulnerable or irrelevant in the rubble-choked streets of Stalingrad. Infantry, particularly well-trained infantry operating in small assault groups, proved to be the decisive arm. The importance of logistics was brutally confirmed. The German Sixth Army starved and froze not because it lacked courage or skill, but because it lacked food, fuel, and ammunition. No amount of bravery can compensate for empty stomachs and frozen weapons. The battle also highlighted the danger of ideological rigidity in military decision-making. Hitler's refusal to allow Paulus to break out of the encirclement, based on nothing but stubborn pride and magical thinking about Luftwaffe capabilities, doomed 300,000 men. Flexibility, the willingness to adjust plans based on changing circumstances, is essential in warfare. Hitler increasingly lacked this flexibility as the war progressed, with catastrophic consequences for Germany. Soviet commanders, having learned this lesson through bitter experience in 1941, were becoming more pragmatic and adaptable, willing to trade space for time, to accept temporary defeats in pursuit of larger victories. Perhaps most significantly, Stalingrad demonstrated the limits of totalitarian warfare waged without regard for human cost. Both Hitler and Stalin were willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives for strategic and symbolic objectives. Both treated their soldiers as expendable resources to be consumed in pursuit of victory. But there is a difference between accepting casualties as inevitable and deliberately creating conditions where casualties become catastrophic. Hitler's strategic errors at Stalingrad were not forced upon him by circumstances. They were choices, bad choices, made worse by his refusal to listen to professional military advice. Stalin made similar errors throughout the war, but he at least eventually learned to delegate operational decisions to competent commanders like Zhukov and Rokossovsky. Hitler never learned this lesson, and Germany paid the price. The physical scars of Stalingrad have largely healed. The city was rebuilt, modern and functional, though memorials and preserved ruins mark the sites of the most intense fighting. The Mamiev Kurgan, the hill that overlooked the city and was the scene of some of the bloodiest combat, is now dominated by an enormous monument called the Motherland Calls, a statue of a woman with a raised sword that has become one of the most recognizable symbols of Soviet victory in the Great Patriotic War. Visitors to Volgograd can tour the ruins of the mill where Rodimtsev's guardsmen made their stand, see preserved fortifications, and visit museums that display artifacts from the battle. But no monument can truly convey what happened there. No museum can capture the reality of what those men endured. The human scars of Stalingrad took generations to fade, and some never did. Children who survived the battle grew up in a destroyed city, many of them orphaned, all of them traumatized. Families across Germany and the Soviet Union lost fathers, sons, and brothers to the frozen ruins on the Volga. The demographic impact was severe, particularly for the Soviet Union, which lost an entire generation of young men to the war. The social and psychological consequences rippled forward through time, affecting post-war reconstruction, Cold War politics, and the collective memory of both nations. Stalingrad became shorthand for ultimate sacrifice, for determination in the face of impossible odds, for the terrible price of ideology carried to its logical extreme. In the broader context of World War II, Stalingrad was the hinge upon which the war in the East turned. Before Stalingrad, Germany was advancing and the Soviet Union was reeling from defeat after defeat. After Stalingrad, the trajectory reversed. Germany would win some tactical victories, would inflict terrible casualties in battles like Kursk, but the strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Red Army. The road from Stalingrad led through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and finally to Berlin itself. The Wehrmacht would never recover the strength or confidence it lost in the ruins of that city on the Volga. Hitler's dream of Lebensraum in the East died in the frozen streets where his finest army was destroyed. For students of military history, Stalingrad stands as a case study in almost every aspect of warfare gone wrong or gone right, depending on one's perspective. It was a failure of intelligence for Germany, which underestimated Soviet capabilities and intentions. It was a failure of logistics, strategy, and command. It was a triumph of defense, of operational art, and of human endurance for the Soviets. It was a tragedy for the hundreds of thousands who died there, regardless of what uniform they wore. The battle has been analyzed in countless books, articles, and studies, each attempting to understand how such a disaster occurred and what lessons can be extracted from the carnage. The legacy of Stalingrad extends beyond military history into culture, memory, and national identity. For Russia, it remains the defining battle of the Great Patriotic War, the moment when the tide turned and victory became possible. Victory Day celebrations in Russia always prominently feature Stalingrad veterans and imagery, honoring their sacrifice and determination. For Germany, Stalingrad is more complicated, a symbol of defeat and the beginning of the end, but also a source of troubling questions about how such a catastrophe was allowed to happen and who bears responsibility. The debate over whether ordinary German soldiers were victims or accomplices in Hitler's war continues to generate controversy and reflection. In the end, what makes Stalingrad so compelling, so terrible, and so important is that it represents warfare stripped of all illusions. This was not glorious. This was not heroic in any conventional sense. This was two massive armies grinding each other into pulp in conditions that reduced men to animal survival instincts. The fact that men on both sides continued to fight under these conditions speaks to something deep in human nature, both admirable and horrifying. They fought because they had no choice, because surrender seemed worse than death, because military discipline and group loyalty override individual self-preservation, because ideology or patriotism or simple momentum carried them forward into the meat grinder. Understanding Stalingrad means grappling with these uncomfortable truths about human behavior in extremis. The Volga River still flows past the city that was once Stalingrad, carrying with it the memories and the ghosts of one of history's most terrible battles. The water is indifferent to what happened on its banks, but we cannot afford to be. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as a monument to human suffering, to the cost of totalitarian ambition, to the courage and resilience of ordinary people caught in circumstances beyond their control or comprehension. It reminds us that warfare, for all its strategic and tactical complexity, ultimately comes down to individual human beings enduring unendurable things. The hundreds of thousands who died in Stalingrad deserve to be remembered not as statistics or pawns in grand strategy, but as people who lived and suffered and died in ways we can barely imagine. Their story, the story of Stalingrad, is one that must be told and retold, not to glorify war, but to understand its true cost, to strip away the abstractions and see warfare as it really is when all the propaganda and strategic justifications are burned away, leaving only the raw human reality of suffering and survival. That is the lesson of Stalingrad, and it is a lesson that remains relevant today, wherever and whenever human beings choose violence as the solution to their conflicts. If this deep exploration into one of World War II's most pivotal and devastating battles has moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new about the true nature of warfare and human endurance, then I invite you to continue this journey through history with us. Here at WW2 War Rewind, we are committed to bringing you thoroughly researched, honest, and immersive documentaries that honor the real events and the real people who lived through them. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss another deep dive into the battles, decisions, and human stories that shaped the Second World War and our modern world. We release new content regularly, each documentary crafted with the same commitment to historical accuracy and compelling storytelling that you've just experienced. Hit that subscribe button now and join a community of history enthusiasts who believe these stories matter, who understand that the past has lessons for the present, and who want to truly understand what happened and why it matters. Thank you for watching WW2 War Rewind, where history is not just dates and facts, but the lived experience of those who came before us.